Well, in our last class, we had read these lines, that is Book 1, Canto 3, on the second or third page. We are speaking of an abrupt change that comes in Ashwapati. A change which bursts forth in him after the contact with the psychic being. So we see the description here. Then came the abrupt transcendent miracle, the most immaculate grandeur could outline, at travail in the occult womb of life, he dreamed magnificence of things to be. A crown of the architecture of the worlds, a mystery of married earth and heaven, annexed divinity to the mortal scheme. A seer was born, a shining guest of time. So we were discussing about this question of the guest of time and the meaning of the word seer, because I said the word seer takes us back to the Vedic terminology of Kavi. Kavi is the seer poet. And we are discussing the question of how a seer is inseparably a poet. And a seer here seems to be one who has dreamed of the magnificence of things to be. I mean, in this context, we can see Ashwapati can foresee the coming future, and the greatest crown of this future seems to be the marriage of earth and heaven. The marriage of earth and heaven, which means divinity annexed to mortal scheme. You can imagine the suggestion there of the transformation. But I remember we had stopped at the question of Sri Aurobindo himself being the seer. What is it that he has seen, and how has he expressed what he has seen? Of course, here my main idea is not to give you the vision of the future that this seer called Sri Aurobindo has given us. More or less we have read about it in the Life Divine, a bit in the Synthesis of Yoga, and of course in some parts here and there of Human Cycle and Ideal of Human Unity. And I mentioned to you last time about the book The Future Poetry, in which he has seen the future race, the future of humanity, from the perspective of the expression of poetry. how the evolution of poetry itself reflects the future consciousness of man. Because poetry, like all other arts, is quite a mirror of the society of the times, the social consciousness. So it's very interesting to see how in the future poetry he traces the entire history of British poetry, beginning with Chaucer, ending with T.S. Eliot, and sees the phases of the growth of human consciousness. And then he sees the beginnings of a greater dawn, or the new dawn, the dawn called the spiritual age, right in the Romantic poets, Keats and Wordsworth and Shelley. And of course, he sees some streaks of that new consciousness in T.S. Eliot and some other American poets. If you remember the name of the poet, Leaves of Grass, who is he? Leaves of Grass? Not Wordsworth. Walt Whitman. So he sees the beginnings of the new in Walt Whitman and Eliot, and before that the Romantic poets. So I'm going to take up the seer in Sri Aurobindo from the poetic angle, not necessarily the vision that we get as a philosopher Sri Aurobindo, which we get in the Life Divine. And for that I have come across a beautiful essay by Nalinikanta Gupta, about whom some of you may know, some may not. He was the one who was directly taught by Sri Aurobindo himself Greek and Latin, appreciation of poetry, and then he grew into quite a perfect example of an integral sadhak. However, my idea is only to bring to our class the appreciation of Sri Aurobindo as a seer poet, not as a seer philosopher. Here is an essay from Nalinikanta Gupta's collected works, volume number 2. The article is called Sri Aurobindo, Ahana and Other Poems. Well, Ahana is again a grandiose poem from Sri Aurobindo, and it's my, maybe audacious if I say it's my advice, that you should read not only Savitri but other poems of Sri Aurobindo. I don't know, somehow we have jumped straight to Savitri without going through his earlier poetry. Well, you would appreciate Savitri much more if you could read his earlier poetry, and where you see this growth of the poet seer, right from his British days, his simple poetry, which was really under the influence of the British poets, and then after coming to India, how he really gathers inspiration from Indian poetry, the Vedas and the Upanishads, and slowly he grows into the poet of Savitri. So it's not that Sri Aurobindo became the poet of Savitri overnight. So it's really a beautiful journey of the poet we see if we read his earlier poems. And of that, Ahana is one of those beautiful poems. That's why the author here, Nalinikanta Gupta, has given the title Sri Aurobindo, Ahana and Other Poems. I'll read out passages from here just to elucidate what we mean by the word seer poet vis-a-vis Sri Aurobindo. What is the world that Sri Aurobindo sees and creates? Poetry is, after all, passion. By passion, I do not mean the fury of emotion, nor the fume of sentimentalism, but what lies behind at their source, what lends them the force they have, the sense of the grandly real, the vivid and pulsating truth. What then is the thing that Sri Aurobindo has visualized, has endowed with a throbbing life and made a poignant reality? Well, friends, I'm purposely reading this because of a particular question in my mind. You see, we have normally a complaint that we cannot understand Sri Aurobindo. We do not understand. Whatever may be the reason, some find his language difficult, some find his thought difficult, some find his imagery difficult. But what comes through this article is why is it that Sri Aurobindo is so difficult to be understood? You see, what we lack, and in my personal view it is this, that those of us who come to Savitri must come through the life divine. And I'm using the word must. That's where we kind of, jump across and then we say, oh, I'm reading Savitri, and then you get stuck and you say, oh my God, I don't understand. Then we take recourse to Mother's quotation saying, no, Mother said, don't try to understand it, just read 3 lines. Well, that's fine. But I'm sure there is a great joy in discovery, in understanding, in appreciation, in going into the depths of the meaning, to get the glimpse of the idea. Because it's not pure mumbo jumbo that you just keep reading and then appreciating the rhythm and the rhyme. It's not Vedas where there's symbolism and we don't understand. I'm sure, at least for me personally, when we read these lines and then you have, even this line which I'm unable to cross, a seer was born, a shining guest of time. You could have read it and said, okay, fine, Ashwapati became a seer and went on. But for me, it's not sufficient to see, oh, Ashwapati. But where I discover Sri Aurobindo himself as a seer, you see, there's a great joy. So that's why I say that you ought to come through Life Divine, because there is a tremendous amount of philosophy here. A tremendous amount, which you see, even the word seer you would have missed completely if you did not know what Vedic meaning of Rishi means, of the Kavi means. So it's not just English per se. There's a lot more behind. There's the Vedas, there's the Upanishads, there's the Gita, there's the Life Divine, and there is his own experience. So we ought to read the Life Divine. Well, if not the whole, as the Mother had advised, at least the last 6 chapters of the Life Divine, which is Ala Sri Aurobindo per se. Well, Book 2, Part-1 is definitely a lot of Indian philosophy reviewed. But Book 1 and Book 2, Part 2 are really Ala Sri Aurobindo. So at least make an attempt to read those chapters, and then you will see the wealth of ideas in Savitri. You see, of course, each one has a right to approach the way you want to, just read it and meditate fine upon. I'm not arguing against that, but it's my personal discovery is, my mind thrills at the discovery of the thought as well as the rhythm, the image. And it's not just the image per se. You see, Toby and Tina, you have been to the treks in the Himalayas. You have shown me your photographs. I mean, they have been telling us about the wonder of the Himalayas, the rocks, the shining snow, the beautiful shadows. Then there's no forest, there's no greenery. The bare beauty of the rocks is so stunning. That's the beauty you get in Savitri. Is bare truth. There's no decoration with imagery like we have in Shakespeare or Kalidas and all other poets. There's no padding with other unnecessary detail. Sri Aurobindo is giving you the Mount Everest in all its pristine beauty, in all its golden shadows. In the morning there's a different beauty, in the afternoon, at night, midnight. I think my friends will tell you better. So that is the grandeur of Savitri. It is not the grandeur of a garden or of a forest. Not finding the wayside flower of Wordsworth. Not finding this little garden with beautiful lilies or the roses. He will not use that. So that is where our mind gets stunned. We are not used to seeing the Himalayas. We are used to seeing the beautiful mountains, the little gardens, the little beautiful pathways on the human level. So that's the impression I get here. And to appreciate that Himalayan beauty, the Everest heights of consciousness, there is a need of a preparation within us. That's where so many people get disappointed. A lot of this so-called, the poets have criticized Savitri because they have not found the sensuous, they have not found the ordinary human vital, the emotions and the sentiments. We have so much of British poetry and even the present Indian poems full of sentiments, emotions, passing emotions. But on not finding all this, our poets in India thought themselves to be great poets if they could criticize Sri Aurobindo. And that had become a fashion, in fact, in mid-70s, if I'm not too wrong, to criticize Sri Aurobindo. By criticizing Sri Aurobindo, you gain some kind of a popularity. But later on, after 30 years, they came round to say, well, we are sorry. Sri Aurobindo is Sri Aurobindo. You cannot compare him with any other poet, with any other genre of poetry, with any other period of poetry, nothing of the sort. So friends, I am bringing out this article, some passages which I have chosen, only to let you know how to appreciate or what to look for in Savitri. Well, you are doing what you are, but I am contributing my own experience, and I find this very beautiful experience expressed in Neda. What is the world that Sri Aurobindo sees and creates? Poetry is, after all, passion. By passion, I do not mean the fury of emotion, nor the fume of sentimentalism, but what lies behind at their source, what lends them the force they have, the sense of the grandly real, the vivid and pulsating truth. What then is the thing that Sri Aurobindo has visualized, has endowed with a throbbing life and made a poignant reality? Victor Hugo said, "Attaché Dieu au gibet, vous avez la croix." Tie God to the gibbet, you have the cross. Even so, infuse passion into a thing most prosaic, you create sublime poetry out of it. What is the dead matter that has found life and glows and vibrates in Sri Aurobindo's passion? It is something which appears to many poetically intractable, not amenable to aesthetic treatment, not usually, that is to say, nor in the supreme manner. Sri Aurobindo has thrown such a material into his poetic fervour and created a sheer beauty, a stupendous reality out of it. Herein lies the greatness of his achievement. I mean, read this, remember this, and go back to Savitri. And read at random. Of course, I will take it up sometime after this class, but just I'm bringing to your notice that he has brought in sheer beauty, a stupendous reality out of it. Philosophy, however divine, and in spite of Milton, has been regarded by poets as harsh and crabbed, and as such unfit for poetic delineation. Well, this has been the perennial argument that the poet should never be a philosopher. Philosophy and poetry are two different things, so let them be separated. But as I've told you many a time, Gita is the greatest poetry. The Upanishads, there is no parallel in poetry. Vedas is absolute mantra. So we have had a tradition in India that highest poetry and highest philosophy, they reflect each other. In fact, the best medium of the highest philosophy is poetry. So we cannot separate as said Milton, that we should not keep them together. Not a few poets indeed floundered upon this rock. A poet in his own way is a philosopher, but a philosopher chanting out his philosophy in sheer poetry has been one of the rarest spectacles. I can think of only one instance just now where a philosopher has almost succeeded being a great poet. I am referring to Lucretius and his De Rerum Natura. Neither Shakespeare nor Homer had anything like philosophy in their poetic creation. And in spite of some inclination to philosophy and philosophical ideas, Virgil and Milton were not philosophers either. Dante sought perhaps consciously and deliberately to philosophize in his paradise, Paradiso. Well, some of you may be surprised to hear some of these things, that even Shakespeare, who is quite a favorite of all of us here, did not have philosophy per se. You see, all his dramas are an absolute reflection of life energy. In fact, in writing to Amal Kiran, Aurobindo would say, there is no poet equal to Shakespeare when it comes to the life energy. I mean, he is a creator of character, of personality. I mean, who maybe they're really in the subtle physical world, they are existent. So he is the creator of persons, personalities. And here we have, of course, I do presume most of us have read his tragedies especially. And we see the life energy. So Aurobindo, I don't remember, has given a gradation of poets in one of his letters to Amal Kiran. And that was a very important letter which has opened my eyes. That you have Valmiki and Vyasa on the top level. Then we have Dante, we have Homer. Then we have Kalidasa. And on the level of Kalidasa, we have Shakespeare. There's a gradation of poets. And then he would say, just like we have Shakespeare in British poetry, we have Kalidasa in Indian poetry. Now he says what happens in poetry is that there are different levels of inspiration. And each level reflects a particular truth of spirituality. So we cannot in a way say that Valmiki, Vyasa are greater than Shakespeare. They are greater in what level? In what way? that they draw inspiration from a higher level of consciousness. Whereas Shakespeare is unparalleled on the level of life. Nobody has created in the whole world till now a personality, a character like Shakespeare, because he is Aurobindo, I don't know if he really uses this word, but I remember something like that he is kind of a second nature to create characters, like nature produces all of us here. So Shakespeare is that emblem, is that instrument of nature to create. And therefore, we see, he says, even any poet, even Aurobindo himself, if he wants to create something on the nature level, he has to come down to the level of Shakespeare. So you see, that's one mistake we should clarify. That it is not necessary that poetry should be all the time written from the supramental level, all the time written from the overmental level. You see, then why is this creation? The whole creation could have been only one consciousness called the overmental consciousness. But the very fact that we have the consciousness from the matter to life to mind to different levels of mind, there's a hierarchy of consciousness. There's a gradation of consciousness. And so you see, this is the beauty of this world, that there's a gradation of consciousness. So one has to go to different levels. That's why in Aurobindo, Savitri also I'll come across and show you when we come across that. There are lines which resemble Shakespeare, lines which resemble Keats. Because if he has to describe something sensuous, it's a Keats or a Kalidasa who have mastered this art. So Aurobindo says, I have to come down to that level which is a perfect expression. For example, a rose is a rose and a lotus is a lotus. You cannot replace them. Each has its own beauty, each has its own fragrance, each has its form, each has its color. That is the wealth of a garden. So if you say, no, it's only the rose garden that is beautiful, it's not right. So in these levels of poetry too, there is such a gradation. And I will just read one paragraph from, again, Nolinida's article called, in the same volume number 2, there's an article called The Shakespearean Word. Well, he has described about Shakespeare, but the last paragraph is really remarkable. Borrowing an analogy from modern knowledge, I may say that the Shakespearean word is a particle or wave of life power. Modern science posits as the basis of the material creation, as its ultimate constituents, these energy particles. Even so, it seems to me that at the basis of all poetic creation, there lie what may be called word particles. And each poet has a characteristic quality or energy of the word unit. The Shakespearean word, I've said, is a life energy packet. Now let's remember this. Shakespearean word is a life energy packet, and therefore in his elaboration of the word, living figures, moving creatures leap up to our sight. Shakespeare himself has said of his hero Romeo, characterizing the supreme beauty the hero embodies, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. That's from Romeo and Juliet. Even so, the whole body of Shakespearean utterances may be described as consisting in the last analysis of starry vocables, quanta of articulate life energy. Yes, Shakespearean syllables are indeed the glorious members cut out of the body, as it were, of a beautiful vital being transmuted into heavenly luminaries. In the world of poetry, Dante is a veritable avatar. His language is a supreme magic. The word unit in him is a quantum of highly concentrated perceptive energy tapas. Please try to understand. I'm giving